Kid asks for leftover food from his school friends. When he explains why, everyone cries. The cafeteria smelled like disinfectant and overcooked vegetables, but 9-year-old Milo Martinez had learned to find comfort in that familiar scent. It meant food was nearby, even if it wasn't his. He sat alone at the far end of table 7, the same spot every day, watching his classmates tear into their lunches with the careless abandon of children who had never known hunger. His own lunch tray sat empty before him, not because he'd eaten, but because he'd never had anything to put on it in the first place. The faded blue hoodie he wore hung loose on his thin frame, sleeves pushed up to his elbows to hide how his wrists looked like twigs. His dark hair needed a cut, falling into his eyes in a way that made him look even smaller than he already was. But those eyes, those deep brown eyes, were always watching, always calculating, always waiting for the right moment. That moment came when Jessica Williams, sitting 3 seats down, pushed away her turkey sandwich with a dramatic sigh. Ugh, I'm so full. Mom always packs too much. Milo's stomach clenched, not from hunger. He'd grown used to that constant ache, but from anticipation. This was his chance. He slid down the bench, moving closer with the practiced stealth of someone who'd learned to make himself invisible. Hey, Jessica, he said softly, his voice barely audible over the cafeteria noise. Are you going to eat that? Jessica looked up, startled. She'd barely noticed Milo before. He was just that quiet kid who always wore the same hoodie. But now, seeing him up close, she noticed the hollow look in his cheeks, the way his eyes lingered on her discarded sandwich like it was treasure. Oh, no, she said, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. I guess you can have it if you want. Milo's face lit up with such genuine gratitude that it made Jessica's chest feel tight. Thanks, he whispered, carefully wrapping the sandwich in a napkin before tucking it into his backpack with reverent hands. This scene played out daily, with minor variations. Sometimes it was half a bag of chips from Marcus, the popular kid who always brought extra snacks. Other times it was leftover apple slices from quiet Emma, who appreciated that Milo never made her feel bad for sharing. He had a sixth sense about which kids might have extras, and he approached each with the same gentle request. Are you going to eat that? But as the weeks passed, the other children began to notice. Whispers started to follow Milo through the hallways like shadows. Did you see him eating Sarah's leftover pizza yesterday? That's so weird. Why doesn't he just buy his own lunch? My mom says kids who take other people's food are just greedy. Maybe his parents don't teach him manners. The cruel logic of children began to take hold. If Milo was asking for food, he must be doing something wrong. The questions became accusations, the generosity became reluctance, and the whispers became pointed stares. One particularly brutal Tuesday, when Milo approached 7th grader Connor about his untouched fruit cup, Connor didn't just say no. He made a show of dumping it in the trash instead. There, Connor announced loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear. Now nobody gets it. Maybe you should ask your parents to pack you a lunch like normal kids. The words hit Milo like physical blows. His face burned with shame as laughter rippled through the nearby tables. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and never face these kids again. But he couldn't. Tomorrow, he'd have to come back. Tomorrow, he'd have to try again. Because at home, in their tiny apartment with the broken heater and empty refrigerator, his 6-year-old sister Lily was waiting. And Lily was getting thinner every day. But the other kids didn't know that. They couldn't see past the surface of what looked like a greedy boy taking food that wasn't his. They didn't know about the nights Milo lay awake listening to Lily's stomach growl, or how he'd started giving her half of whatever he managed to bring home, telling her he wasn't hungry even when his own belly felt like it was eating itself from the inside. When pressed about why he wanted their leftovers, Milo had learned to deflect with silly stories that made the other kids laugh instead of pity him. I'm collecting crusts for a science project about mold, he'd say with forced cheer. I'm building a sandwich tower in my room to see how high it can go before it falls over. The lies came easier than the truth. The truth was too heavy, too shameful, too real. The truth would make him the charity case, the poor kid everyone felt sorry for. And Milo had watched enough movies to know that once you became the charity case, you stopped being a person. You became a problem to solve, a good deed to do, a story to tell about how generous everyone else was. So he lied, and he smiled, and he collected their scraps like treasures, never letting on that each leftover apple core, each abandoned sandwich half, each lonely cookie might be the difference between his sister sleeping through the night or crying from hunger pains. But lies, like buildings made of leftover sandwiches, eventually crumble. And Milo's carefully constructed world of deflection and humor was about to come crashing down in the most unexpected way. The question that would change everything was coming. And when it arrived, delivered by a girl who'd been taught never to waste food and always to ask the hard questions, Milo would find himself standing at a crossroads between the comfortable darkness of his secret and the terrifying possibility of being truly seen. 3 weeks after the Connor incident, Milo had developed a new strategy. He'd learned to read the cafeteria like a map, identifying the most promising targets for his daily food rescue mission. He knew that Amy-chan always brought 2 sandwiches, but only ate one. He knew that Tyler Rodriguez's grandmother packed him enough snacks for 3 kids. And he knew that Tina Morrison, the new girl with the neat braids and serious expression, never left a single crumb on her tray. That last observation should have been a warning. Tina wasn't like the other kids who threw away food without thinking. She'd been raised by a grandmother who had lived through genuine hardship, who had taught her that wasting food was not just rude, it was a sin against those who had none. So when Tina watched Milo make his rounds day after day, collecting discarded lunches with the methodical precision of someone whose life depended on it, she didn't see greed or strangeness. She saw need. And need, her grandmother had taught her, was nothing to be ashamed of, but it was also nothing to ignore. It was a gray Thursday in March when everything changed. The cafeteria was louder than usual, filled with the excited chatter of kids making weekend plans. Milo sat in his usual spot, waiting for the right moment to begin his careful collection. His stomach was a hollow ache that had become background noise, but today felt different. Harder. The night before, Lily had barely touched the half sandwich he'd brought home, claiming she wasn't hungry even though he could see the way her school clothes hung loose on her shrinking frame. When Milo approached Brandon's table, where the boy had left 3 untouched cookies from his lunch pack, he expected the usual easy transaction. Brandon barely looked up from his Nintendo DS as he waved Milo away. Yeah, sure, whatever. But as Milo reached for the cookies, a clear voice cut through the cafeteria noise. Why do you want them? Milo froze, his hand halfway to the cookies. He turned to see Tina Morrison watching him with those serious brown eyes, her head tilted slightly, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. What? Milo asked, his voice smaller than he intended. The cookies, Tina said, not unkindly but with a directness that made Milo's skin prickle with anxiety. Why do you want them? You ask for food every day, but you never eat it here. You just put it in your backpack. The nearby conversations began to quiet as other kids tuned in to this unexpected confrontation. Milo felt heat rise in his cheeks as familiar panic set in. This was the moment he'd been dreading, the question he'd been avoiding with jokes and deflection for months. He stammered, falling back on his usual repertoire of silly explanations. I'm doing this experiment, about how different foods decompose at different rates, and… No, you're not. Tina interrupted, not meanly, but with absolute certainty. That's not why. I've been watching you for weeks. You're really careful with the food, like it matters. Like it's important. What? The cafeteria had grown noticeably quieter now, with kids at the surrounding tables openly staring. Milo felt trapped, pinned like a butterfly under Tina's unwavering gaze. His throat felt tight, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he might cry right there in front of everyone. He began, then stopped. The lie wouldn't come. Under Tina's patient, knowing stare, all his carefully constructed explanations crumbled like stale bread. Brandon looked up from his game, suddenly interested. Yeah, actually, that is kind of weird. Why don't you ever eat lunch here? Don't your parents give you lunch money? More heads turned. More eyes focused on Milo's thin frame, his faded clothes, his worn-out sneakers with the hole near the toe that he tried to hide by scuffing his feet when he walked. My mom, Milo started, then stopped again. His hands were shaking now, and he shoved them deep into his hoodie pockets to hide the tremors. She's just, she packs my lunch differently, and… You don't have lunch, Tina said quietly. It wasn't a question. The simple statement hung in the air like smoke. Milo stared at her, feeling exposed and raw, as if she'd somehow seen straight through all his pretenses to the scared, hungry boy underneath. That's not, he began, but his voice cracked. You take the food home, Tina continued, her voice gentle but relentless in its honesty. You ask for leftovers because you need them, not for experiments or towers or whatever. You need them. Milo's vision blurred. He could feel the stares of his classmates like physical weight, could hear the whispered conversations starting up around them. This was his worst nightmare playing out in real time, being seen, being known, being pitted. Why? Tina asked again, and this time her voice was so soft, so free of judgment, that it somehow made everything worse. You can tell me. I won't laugh. Milo looked around the cafeteria, at all the faces watching him with curiosity and confusion and the beginning of understanding. He thought about Lily at home, probably napping on their mom's bed because she didn't have the energy to play anymore. He thought about their empty refrigerator, their overdue bills, their mother's exhausted face when she thought her children weren't looking. The truth sat in his throat like a stone, too big to swallow, too painful to speak. But under Tina's patient gaze, surrounded by the weight of his classmates' attention, Milo realized he was out of lies, out of deflections, out of ways to hide. He whispered, then cleared his throat and tried again. It's for my little sister. The words came out cracked and small, but in the relative quiet of the cafeteria, they carried clearly. Several kids leaned forward, straining to hear. She's sick, Milo continued, the dam finally breaking. And his voice caught. We don't have much food left at home. The silence that followed was deafening. Milo stared at his shoes, unable to look up, unable to face whatever expressions were painting his classmates' faces. He'd done it now. He'd admitted the truth that he'd been so carefully hiding for months. He was the poor kid, the charity case, the one everyone would either pity or blame. But when he finally found the courage to lift his eyes, he didn't see the mockery or disgust he'd expected. Instead, he saw something that made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. He saw tears. Tina's eyes were bright with unshed tears, her hand pressed to her mouth as if trying to hold back words or sobs. Brandon had gone very still, his game forgotten in his lap. At the next table over, Jessica Williams was staring at Milo with wide, horrified eyes, her hand reaching unconsciously for the lunch she'd barely touched. Your sister is sick? Tina whispered. Milo nodded, not trusting his voice. And you've been bringing her food from school? Another nod. Every day. Milo's throat worked soundlessly for a moment before he managed to croak out. When I can. The truth hung between them like a bridge, scary to cross, but somehow necessary. And as Milo stood there, trembling with the aftermath of finally being honest, he realized that maybe, just maybe, being seen wasn't the end of the world after all. Maybe it was the beginning of something else entirely. Word spreads through elementary schools the way water finds cracks in concrete, slowly at first, then all at once, until everyone knows and no one remembers exactly how they learned it. By Friday afternoon, 3 days after Milo's confession in the cafeteria, his story had become the worst-kept secret at Lincoln Elementary. But something unexpected happened in the telling and retelling. Instead of becoming fodder for gossip or ridicule, Milo's situation had sparked something else entirely. A quiet revolution of 9-year-old hearts that refused to accept that one of their own was going hungry. It started with Tina, who went home that Thursday night and told her grandmother everything. Mrs. Chun, who had raised Tina with stories of her own childhood during wartime, listened with the gravitas of someone who understood that hunger was not a character flaw but a circumstance that could befall anyone. What did you do? She asked her granddaughter. Nothing yet, Tina admitted. But I want to help. Can I bring extra lunch for him? Mrs. Chin smiled, the kind of smile that held decades of hard-won wisdom. Of course, child. But be smart about it. Pride is a hungry person's last possession. Don't take that from him too. Armed with her grandmother's blessing and wisdom, Tina became the architect of what the kids would later call the lunch mission. But she wasn't alone. Jessica Williams, who had been haunted by the memory of all the sandwiches she'd thrown away over the years, convinced her mother to pack double portions. Brandon, still shaken by the realization that his classmate had been suffering in silence, started bringing extra snacks in case he got hungry later. The beauty of their plan was in its subtlety. They didn't make announcements or create a formal system. Instead, they operated like a benevolent spy network, passing intelligence about who had extras and orchestrating casual encounters that would give Milo opportunities to ask for food without feeling like he was being pitted. Tina would leave half her sandwich wrapped on the table and then get up to throw something away, giving Milo a chance to ask about it without an audience. Jessica would loudly declare that her mom had packed way too much again, setting up the perfect opening. Brandon would casually mention that he didn't like certain snacks, knowing Milo would quietly ask if he could have them. For 2 weeks, the system worked beautifully. Milo's backpack went home heavier each day, filled with carefully acquired treasures that meant Lily could have real meals instead of the thin soup their mother had been stretching to last for days. The little girl's energy began to return, and for the first time in months, Milo allowed himself to believe that maybe things were going to be okay. He should have known that good things, in his experience, rarely lasted long. The trouble started on a rainy Tuesday when Mrs. Patterson, the lunch monitor, noticed what looked like suspicious activity at table 7. She'd been watching the cafeteria for 15 years, and she prided herself on maintaining order and discipline. When she saw Milo carefully wrapping food and placing it in his backpack, not just once, but multiple times throughout the lunch period, her administrator instincts kicked into high gear. Food wasn't supposed to leave the cafeteria. It was a health code violation, a liability issue, and frankly, it looked like stealing. Mrs. Patterson waited until the end of lunch, watching as Milo zipped up his suspiciously full backpack and headed for the door. She intercepted him just outside the cafeteria, her hand firmly planted on his shoulder. "Young man," she said in the voice that had stopped countless food fights and unauthorized hallway wanderings, "I need to see what's in that backpack." Milo's blood turned to ice water. He clutched the straps of his backpack, knowing that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. It's just my stuff. Open it," Mrs. Patterson commanded, and there was no arguing with that tone. With shaking hands, Milo unzipped his backpack. The contents spilled out like evidence at a crime scene. 2 sandwiches wrapped in napkins, a bag of chips, 3 cookies, an apple, and a juice box that Tina had slipped him on her way to recess. Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed as she took in the haul. "Where did you get all this food?" Milo's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Kids gave it to me." "Gave it to you?" Mrs. Patterson's tone suggested she found this explanation highly unlikely. "You mean you took it from them?" "No." The word burst out of Milo with desperate force. "They said I could have it. They didn't want it." But Mrs. Patterson had seen enough. A thin boy with a backpack full of pilfered lunch food, making excuses about other children giving it to him. It was textbook theft, dressed up in a sad story designed to evoke sympathy. "We're going to the office," she announced, beginning to gather up the scattered food. "And we're calling your mother." The walk to the principal's office felt like a death march. Milo's mind raced with panic as he thought about his mother having to leave work, if she even still had work, to come deal with her son's stealing. He thought about Lily, who would go to bed hungry tonight because his backpack full of food was now evidence in Mrs. Patterson's hands. He thought about facing his classmates tomorrow, knowing that everyone would learn he'd been caught taking food like some kind of common thief. Principal Martinez was a kind man who genuinely cared about his students, but he was also a busy administrator dealing with budget cuts, staffing issues, and the constant pressure to maintain order in a school system stretched thin. When Mrs. Patterson marched into his office with a tearful Milo and a bag full of confiscated food, his first instinct was to handle the situation quickly and efficiently. "Milo," he said, gesturing for the boy to sit in the chair across from his desk. "Mrs. Patterson tells me you've been taking food from other students. Is this true?" Milo wanted to explain about Tina and Jessica and Brandon, about his sick sister and their empty refrigerator, about how the food really was given freely by kids who wanted to help. But sitting in that big chair, facing the principal's serious expression while Mrs. Patterson stood behind him like a stern sentinel, the words wouldn't come. "They said I could have it," he whispered instead. Principal Martinez sighed. He'd heard variations of this story before. Children taking things that didn't belong to them and then claiming they had permission. It was disappointing, but not uncommon, and he had a standard protocol for handling it. "I'm going to need to call your mother," he said, reaching for his phone. "We need to discuss this situation with her and figure out appropriate consequences." As the principal dialed, Milo closed his eyes and felt his world crumbling around him. He'd tried so hard to protect his family's dignity, to handle their problems quietly and without burdening anyone else. But now everyone would know. His mother would be humiliated, his sister would go hungry, and he would be labeled as the kid who stole lunches. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. Principal Martinez frowned and tried again, with the same result. He murmured, making a note in Milo's file. We'll keep trying to reach her. In the meantime, you'll need to stay here while we sort this out. But as Milo sat in that uncomfortable chair, staring at his shoes and fighting back tears, neither he nor Principal Martinez realized that someone else had been listening to the entire conversation through the slightly open office door. Someone who knew the real story. Someone who was about to change everything. Ms. Rodriguez had been Lincoln Elementary's guidance counselor for 8 years, long enough to develop an instinct for when things weren't quite what they seemed. She'd been walking past Principal Martinez's office when she heard the raised voices and paused, not to eavesdrop, but because she recognized the small, frightened voice trying to explain something about food. Milo Martinez. She knew that name, had seen it cross her desk in various contexts over the past few months. Never for behavioral problems or academic issues, but for smaller things that, when viewed together, painted a concerning picture. He'd been late to school several times, always with notes about family obligations. His teacher had mentioned that he seemed tired during afternoon classes. The nurse had noted that he'd visited her office twice for stomach aches that seemed to resolve around lunchtime. Standing outside the principal's office, listening to Mrs. Patterson describe Milo's theft and watching through the crack in the door as the boy hunched in on himself like a wounded animal, Ms. Rodriguez felt the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. She waited until Principal Martinez finished his unsuccessful attempts to reach Milo's mother, then knocked softly on the door frame. "Excuse me," she said, stepping into the office with the calm authority that came with years of crisis intervention. "I happened to overhear the situation. Milo, would you mind if I asked you a few questions?" Principal Martinez looked relieved at the intervention. Ms. Rodriguez had a way with difficult students, and if anyone could get to the bottom of this food theft situation, it would be her. "Of course," he said, settling back in his chair. Mrs. Patterson was just explaining. "Actually," Ms. Rodriguez interrupted gently, "I'd like to speak with Milo privately, if that's all right. Sometimes children are more comfortable sharing the whole story when there are fewer adults present." Mrs. Patterson bristled slightly. "I saw what I saw. The boy had a backpack full of food that didn't belong to him." "I'm sure you did," Ms. Rodriguez replied with diplomatic smoothness. "And I appreciate you bringing it to our attention. But let me talk with Milo for a few minutes, and then we can all discuss the best way to handle this situation." It wasn't really a request. After 8 years in the school system, Ms. Rodriguez had learned how to speak with the voice of someone who expected to be obeyed, even when she was being perfectly polite about it. Principal Martinez nodded. "Of course. Milo, go with Ms. Rodriguez to her office. We'll continue this conversation shortly." Ms. Rodriguez's office was different from the principal's, warmer, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs arranged more like a living room than a formal meeting space. The walls were covered with children's artwork and inspirational posters, and there was a small basket of fidget toys on the coffee table for students who needed something to do with their hands while they talked. Milo sat on the edge of one of the chairs, still clutching his empty backpack and looking like he expected the world to end at any moment. Ms. Rodriguez settled across from him, her posture open and non-threatening. "Milo," she said quietly, "I want you to know that you're not in trouble with me. My job is to help kids, not to punish them. Can you tell me what's really going on?" The kindness in her voice nearly undid him. After weeks of careful pretense and the terror of the last hour, being spoken to with genuine compassion felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. "I didn't steal anything," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "The other kids really did give me the food. They knew," his voice caught. "They knew I needed it." Needed it for what, honey? And there it was, the question he'd been dreading and deflecting for months. But sitting in Ms. Rodriguez's gentle presence, surrounded by the evidence of her care for children, Milo found that the truth felt less like a shameful secret and more like a burden he was finally allowed to set down. "For my sister," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "She's only 6, and she's been sick, and my mom lost her job, and we don't have much food at home, and I thought if I could just bring home what other kids weren't going to eat anyway, maybe Lily wouldn't have to go to bed hungry anymore." Ms. Rodriguez felt her heart crack. She'd suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed. Hearing the careful way Milo described his sister's hunger and his mother's job loss brought tears to her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly. "How long has this been going on?" "Since before Christmas," Milo admitted. "Mom got laid off right before Thanksgiving. She's been trying to find another job, but there's nothing, and the unemployment money isn't enough, and Lily keeps getting thinner, and I just—" His composure finally cracked, and the tears he'd been fighting began to fall. "I just wanted to help. I didn't know what else to do." Ms. Rodriguez moved to the chair beside him, offering a box of tissues. "You've been trying to take care of your whole family, haven't you?" Milo nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm the man of the house now. That's what Mom says. But I'm not very good at it." "Oh, honey, you're 9 years old. Taking care of a family isn't your job. But if I don't, who will?" The question came out as a wail, and Ms. Rodriguez realized she was looking at a child who had been carrying adult responsibilities for months, crushing himself under the weight of problems far too big for his small shoulders. "There are people whose job it is to help families like yours," she said gently. "Adults who are trained to handle these situations. You shouldn't have had to carry this burden alone." "But we're not supposed to need help," Milo protested. "Mom always says we take care of ourselves. She says asking for help means we're not trying hard enough." Ms. Rodriguez sighed. She'd heard this before. Families caught in the gap between pride and need, suffering in silence because they'd been taught that struggle was a personal failing rather than a systemic issue. "Milo," she said carefully, "sometimes the strongest thing we can do is ask for help. It doesn't mean we're not trying hard enough. It means we're smart enough to know when a problem is bigger than we can handle alone." She paused, watching his face as he processed this idea. "You've been incredibly brave and resourceful, trying to help your family the way you have. But what if I told you there were ways to help them that didn't require you to worry about where your next meal was coming from?" Hope flickered in Milo's eyes, quickly followed by wariness. "What kind of ways?" "Well, for starters, we have programs here at school to make sure kids don't go hungry. Free breakfast and lunch for families who qualify. Food pantries that provide groceries. Organizations that help people find jobs. Social workers who specialize in helping families get back on their feet." "But Mom said—" "Your mom is trying to protect your family's dignity," Ms. Rodriguez interrupted gently. "That's her job as a parent. But sometimes parents need help figuring out the best way to do that. Would it be okay if I called your mom and talked to her about some options?" Milo hesitated. He'd spent so many months trying to shield his mother from additional stress, trying to handle their problems quietly so she could focus on job hunting and taking care of Lily. The idea of involving more adults, more complications, felt scary. But he was also tired. Bone deep, soul-crushing tired of carrying secrets and making desperate plans and lying awake at night listening to his sister's empty stomach growl. The thought of adults who actually knew how to solve these problems taking some of the weight off his shoulders was almost too appealing to resist. "She's going to be upset," he warned. "She might be," Ms. Rodriguez agreed. "Change is scary, even when it's good change. But I think your mom loves you and your sister enough to be willing to be uncomfortable if it means keeping you both healthy and safe." Milo thought about this, twisting his hands in his lap. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "You can call her." Ms. Rodriguez smiled. "Good. But first, I need to go explain to Principal Martinez what's really been happening here. You're not in trouble, Milo. What you did, taking care of your family, that shows incredible love and courage. But now it's time to let the adults handle the adult problems, okay?" As she stood to leave, Milo called after her. "Ms. Rodriguez?" The other kids, Tina and Jessica and Brandon and everyone, they were just trying to help too. They didn't do anything wrong. "I know, honey. And I think it's beautiful that your classmates cared enough about you to want to help. That says something wonderful about the kind of person you are, that people want to take care of you." She paused at the door. "You know what this means, don't you?" Milo shook his head. "It means you're not alone anymore. And you never have to be again." The call to Maria Martinez came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, right in the middle of her third job interview of the week. She'd been sitting in the cramped waiting room of a medical billing company, rehearsing answers to questions about her employment gap when her phone buzzed with the school's number. Her first instinct was panic. Had something happened to Milo or Lily? But Ms. Rodriguez's calm, gentle voice on the other end of the line only heightened her anxiety. Guidance counselors didn't call with good news. Mrs. Martinez, I wonder if you could come in to discuss Milo's situation. There's been an incident involving food, and I think it would be helpful if we could talk. Maria's heart sank. She'd been dreading this call for months. Ever since she'd noticed Milo's backpack occasionally coming home with mysterious snacks he claimed were extras from friends. She'd suspected what he was doing, but hadn't had the courage to confront it directly, telling herself that as long as he wasn't technically stealing, maybe it was okay. Maybe it was just resourcefulness. Deep down, she'd known better. The walk from the parking lot to the school felt like a gauntlet of shame. Maria straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, drawing on the dignity that had carried her through months of rejection letters and overdue notices. Whatever was about to happen, she would face it with her head high. But when she walked into Ms. Rodriguez's office and saw Milo's tear-stained face, her carefully constructed composure crumbled. "Oh, Mijo," she whispered, dropping into the chair beside him and pulling him into her arms. "What happened?" "I told them," Milo mumbled against her shoulder. "About Lily being sick. About us not having food. I'm sorry, Mama. I tried to keep it secret, but they found out anyway." Maria felt her world tilt. The secret she'd fought so hard to keep, the pride she'd been clinging to like armor. It was all gone now, exposed under the fluorescent lights of a school office. "Mrs. Martinez," Ms. Rodriguez said gently, "Milo has been trying to help your family by bringing home leftover food from lunch. Other students have been giving it to him, but the lunch monitor saw him putting food in his backpack and assumed he was stealing." The words hit Maria like physical blows. Her 9-year-old son had been begging for scraps from his classmates while she'd been pretending everything was fine. While she'd been telling him they were just going through a rough patch, that things would get better soon, he'd been taking on the adult responsibility of feeding his family. "I didn't know," she whispered, then caught herself. That wasn't true. She had known, or at least suspected. She'd just been too proud and too scared to acknowledge it. "I mean, I thought maybe, but I hoped." "Mrs. Martinez," Ms. Rodriguez interrupted kindly, "you're not being judged here. We want to help." "Help?" Maria's voice came out sharper than she intended, years of self-reliance rising up like a protective wall. "We don't need help. This is just temporary. I have job interviews and—" "Mama," Milo's small voice cut through her defensive words. "Lily's getting skinnier. And you are too. And I heard you crying last night when you thought we were asleep." The simple honesty of his words shattered something inside Maria. She looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw the dark circles under his eyes, the way his shirt hung loose on his thin frame, the adult worry creasing his child's face. When had he gotten so small? When had she stopped seeing how much he was carrying? "The electricity got turned off last week," Milo continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "And Lily asked me why we don't have milk anymore, and I didn't know what to tell her." Maria felt the last of her defenses crumble. The careful narrative she'd constructed, that this was temporary, that they were managing fine, that asking for help was weakness, dissolved under the weight of her son's quiet desperation. "Oh, God," she breathed, pressing her face into her hands. "What have I done? I thought I was protecting you both by keeping this private, but I was just protecting my own pride." Ms. Rodriguez leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Martinez, pride isn't a luxury you can afford when your children are hungry. And the beautiful thing is, you don't have to choose between dignity and help. There are ways to get your family back on their feet that honor your strength while meeting your needs." Maria looked up, wiping her eyes. "What kind of ways?" "Well, for starters, both your children qualify for free breakfast and lunch here at school. That takes the pressure off you for 2 meals a day, 5 days a week. There's also a food pantry through St. Catherine's that provides groceries with no questions asked. You just show up." Ms. Rodriguez pulled out a folder thick with information sheets. "There's a job placement program through the county that specializes in helping people who've been unemployed for extended periods. They provide interview coaching, help with resume gaps, even temporary childcare during interviews. And there's emergency assistance for utilities. We can probably get your electricity turned back on within 48 hours. The list seemed endless, overwhelming in its comprehensiveness. Maria stared at the papers, feeling simultaneously grateful and foolish. All this help had been available while she'd been struggling alone, too proud to admit she needed it. "Why didn't anyone tell me about these programs before?" she asked. Because most people don't know they exist until they need them, Ms. Rodriguez replied. And because families like yours, working families who've hit a rough patch, often fall through the cracks. You're not poor enough for some programs, not employed enough for others. But that doesn't mean there's nothing available. Milo shifted beside his mother, his small hand finding hers. Does this mean Lily can get better? Ms. Rodriguez exchanged a glance with Maria. Milo, can you tell me more about your sister being sick? Maria tensed. This was the part she'd been dreading most, the admission that would mark her as a truly inadequate mother. She's just tired all the time, Milo explained. And sometimes she gets dizzy. Mom says it's because she's growing, but she's not growing. She's getting smaller. When was the last time Lily saw a doctor? Ms. Rodriguez asked gently. We don't have insurance, Maria admitted, her voice barely audible. I lost it when I lost my job. And the emergency room is so expensive, and she doesn't seem really sick, just malnourished, Ms. Rodriguez finished, not unkindly, but with the bluntness necessary to cut through denial. Mrs. Martinez, there are community health centers that provide care on a sliding scale. We need to get Lily seen by a medical professional as soon as possible. The room fell silent as the full scope of the family's situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. Maria felt the weight of months of poor decisions, of pride that had become stubbornness, of fear that had paralyzed her into inaction. I've failed them, she whispered. I've completely failed my children. No, Ms. Rodriguez said firmly. You've hit a rough patch, and you made some choices that seemed right at the time, but turned out to be harder than necessary. That doesn't make you a failure. It makes you human. She leaned forward, making sure Maria met her eyes. Do you know what I see when I look at your son? I see a child who loves his family so much that he was willing to risk embarrassment and punishment to make sure they didn't go hungry. Do you think a failed parent raises a child like that? Maria looked at Milo, really seeing him for the first time in months. Not the burden she'd been trying to protect or the problem she'd been trying to solve, but the extraordinary little boy who'd been quietly holding their family together while she'd been falling apart. You've been so brave, she told him, her voice thick with tears and pride and regret. But you shouldn't have had to be. That's my job. Can I still help? Milo asked anxiously. I know I'm just a kid, but I want to help take care of Lily too. Maria smiled through her tears. Of course you can help. But your job is to be 9 years old, not to be the man of the house. My job is to be the mom. As if saying the words out loud had reminded her how to inhabit the role, Maria straightened her shoulders and turned to Ms. Rodriguez with new determination. What do we need to do first? Over the next hour, they developed an action plan. Ms. Rodriguez made calls to get the electricity turned back on, enrolled both children in the free meal program, and scheduled an appointment at the community health center for Lily. She gave Maria information about 3 different job placement programs and helped her fill out applications for emergency food assistance. But the most important call was the one Ms. Rodriguez made to Principal Martinez, explaining the real situation and ensuring that Milo would face no consequences for his theft. In fact, she suggested, maybe the school could learn something from how Milo's classmates had responded to his need. What do you mean? Principal Martinez asked. I mean, those children saw a classmate in need and found a way to help him while preserving his dignity. They created an informal support system that worked beautifully until adult assumptions about theft got in the way. Maybe we should be asking ourselves how we can formalize that kind of peer support instead of punishing it. As Maria and Milo prepared to leave the office, laden with resource packets and phone numbers and appointment cards, Ms. Rodriguez had one more thing to share. Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know that this story doesn't end here. What happened today, Milo's courage in asking for help, your willingness to accept it, the way his classmates rallied around him. This is the beginning of something bigger. What do you mean? Ms. Rodriguez smiled mysteriously. Let's just say that sometimes, when we're brave enough to tell our true stories, they have a way of inspiring others to tell theirs. And when that happens, real change becomes possible. As they walked to the car, Milo slipped his hand into his mother's. Mama, are we going to be okay? For the first time in months, Maria felt qualified to answer that question honestly. Yes, Mijo, we're going to be okay. But neither of them realized that their story was about to become much bigger than just their family's private struggle. By the next morning, the tale of the 9-year-old boy who fed his family with leftover lunch would begin its journey from whispered secret to local legend. carrying with it the power to transform not just their lives, but the lives of countless other families facing the same impossible choice between pride and survival. 3 days after the meeting in Ms. Rodriguez's office, something unexpected happened at Lincoln Elementary. It started with Tina Morrison, who arrived at school on Friday morning with a backpack noticeably heavier than usual. She'd spent the previous evening in her grandmother's kitchen, helping to pack what Mrs. Chun called friendship lunches, extra sandwiches, homemade cookies, and fruit cups that were accidentally packed in quantities too large for one child to eat alone. Remember, Mrs. Chun had instructed her granddaughter, "You're not giving charity. You're sharing abundance." There's a difference. Tina understood. The distinction mattered, especially now that she knew Milo's full story. Ms. Rodriguez had spoken to the children who'd been helping Milo, not to scold them, but to praise their instincts and help them understand how to support their classmate more effectively. But Tina wasn't the only one who'd had conversations at home. Jessica Williams had told her parents about Milo's situation, leading to a dinner table discussion about food insecurity that had opened her family's eyes to problems they'd never considered. Brandon Rodriguez had asked his grandmother why some families didn't have enough food, sparking a conversation about economic inequality that left him determined to do more than just share his extra snacks. By Friday morning, what had started as a handful of children quietly helping one classmate had evolved into something more intentional and organized. The kids had developed their own informal network, coordinating who would bring what and ensuring that Milo never felt singled out or pitted. But their efforts didn't go unnoticed by the adults. Mrs. Henderson, the fourth-grade teacher who supervised morning arrival, watched with growing amazement as children filed into her classroom with bulging lunch boxes and backpacks stuffed with food. When she asked what was going on, the response surprised her. "We're making sure nobody goes hungry," Tina explained matter-of-factly. "Milo was taking care of his family, and now we're taking care of each other." "Taking care of each other how?" "Well," Jessica chimed in, "my mom said there might be other kids who don't have enough food at home, so we're bringing extra for anyone who needs it. Not just Milo." Mrs. Henderson felt her throat tighten. In 15 years of teaching, she'd seen plenty of generosity from children, but this felt different. This felt like social justice being born in the hearts of 9-year-olds. She called Ms. Rodriguez during her lunch break. "You need to see what's happening in my classroom," she said. "These kids have started their own food distribution program." Ms. Rodriguez wasn't entirely surprised. She'd seen how Milo's story had affected his classmates, and she'd hoped that the experience might teach them something valuable about community and compassion. But when she visited Mrs. Henderson's classroom that afternoon, she was struck by the sophistication of what the children had created. They'd established a sharing station in the back of the room, a small table where children could leave extra food and others could take what they needed, no questions asked. They developed a system of subtle signals to let each other know when someone might need support. Most remarkably, they'd done it all without making anyone feel ashamed or different. "How did you know to do this?" Ms. Rodriguez asked Tina. "My grandmother says that taking care of each other is what communities do," Tina replied. "She says that when we have enough and someone else doesn't, sharing isn't charity. It's just being human." Ms. Rodriguez felt tears prick her eyes. These children had instinctively understood something that many adults struggled with, that dignity and assistance weren't mutually exclusive, that helping others could be done in ways that honored both the giver and the receiver. That weekend, she found herself thinking about the implications of what she'd witnessed. If fourth graders could create an effective, dignity-preserving food security program, what did that say about the systems that adults had put in place? What could the school learn from their approach? She wasn't the only one asking these questions. Principal Martinez had been quietly observing the changes in his school since Milo's situation had come to light. He'd seen the way other teachers had started paying closer attention to signs of food insecurity among their students. He'd noticed maintenance staff making comments about kids who seemed especially grateful for the free breakfast offerings. He'd fielded calls from parents asking about volunteer opportunities and ways to support families in need. Most significantly, he'd begun to recognize how many children might be facing similar struggles to Milo's family. Children who were too proud or too scared to ask for help, falling through the cracks of systems designed to catch them. At the monthly school board meeting, Principal Martinez found himself presenting an unexpected agenda item. "I'd like to propose a pilot program," he announced to the assembled board members. We're calling it No Hungry Hearts, and it's based on a model developed by our fourth-grade students. He went on to explain Milo's story and the response it had generated, both from his classmates and from the broader school community. He described the sharing station, the way children had organized themselves to ensure no one went without, and the remarkable absence of stigma or shame in their approach. What these children have shown us, he concluded, is that food security isn't just about having programs available. It's about making those programs accessible in ways that preserve dignity and build community. Board member Patricia Chun, Tina's great-aunt, though none of them realized the connection at the time, leaned forward with interest. What exactly are you proposing? A systematic but discreet approach to identifying and supporting food insecure students, Principal Martinez replied. Weekend backpack programs, summer meal initiatives, family grocery assistance, all designed around the principle that help should strengthen families rather than stigmatize them. The proposal passed unanimously, but it almost didn't matter. Because by the time the school board was voting on the No Hungry Hearts program, Milo's story had already begun to spread beyond the walls of Lincoln Elementary. It started when Sarah Williams, Jessica's older sister, posted about her little sister's sharing station on social media. The post was meant for family and friends, just a proud big sister bragging about how awesome her sibling was being. But the story struck a nerve. Within hours, Sarah's post had been shared dozens of times. Within days, it had been picked up by local parenting blogs and community Facebook groups. And when a freelance journalist named Mike Chun, no relation to Patricia or Mrs. Chun, despite the shared name, saw the story circulating online, he recognized its potential immediately. Mike had built his career writing human interest pieces for regional magazines and newspapers, but he'd never encountered a story quite like this one. A 9-year-old boy secretly feeding his family with school leftovers, classmates organizing their own food security network, adults learning about dignity and community from children. It had all the elements of the kind of story that could really resonate with people. He reached out to Principal Martinez, who referred him to Ms. Rodriguez, who eventually connected him with Maria Martinez. After several conversations and careful consideration of privacy concerns, the family agreed to share their story publicly. Why? Mike asked Maria during their first interview. Why are you willing to make this public when you fought so hard to keep it private? Maria glanced over at Milo, who was doing homework at their kitchen table under the light of electricity that had been restored thanks to the emergency assistance program. Because Ms. Rodriguez was right, she said quietly. When we're brave enough to tell our true stories, they have the power to help other people tell theirs. And maybe if other families hear about this, they won't have to struggle alone the way we did. Mike's article, titled The Boy Who Fed His Family, How One Child's Quiet Courage Sparked a Movement, ran in the regional Sunday magazine 3 weeks later. It was accompanied by photos of Milo and his classmates at their sharing station, of Maria at her new job. She'd been hired through one of the placement programs Ms. Rodriguez had recommended, and of 6-year-old Lily, whose health had improved dramatically once she'd started getting regular meals and medical care. But the most powerful image was the simplest, Milo's hands, small and careful, wrapping a sandwich in a napkin, not because he was hoarding food anymore, but because he was preparing to share it with a classmate who'd mentioned being hungry. The article was supposed to run once and be forgotten, like most human interest pieces. Instead, it went viral. Within days of publication, Mike's editor was fielding calls from national news outlets. The Associated Press picked up the story, followed by CNN, NPR, and dozens of other media organizations. Hashtag #NoHungryHearts began trending on social media, with people sharing their own stories of childhood food insecurity and community support. But the attention that would truly change everything came from an unexpected source: Chef Antonio Valdez, owner of 3 upscale restaurants in the state capital and winner of multiple culinary awards. Chef Valdez had grown up homeless, moving from shelter to shelter with his mother and younger siblings. He'd learned to cook in church kitchens and soup kitchens, had worked his way through culinary school with a combination of scholarships and 3 jobs, and had built his restaurant empire with the understanding that food was about much more than nutrition. It was about dignity, community, and hope. When he read Milo's story, he saw himself at 9 years old, resourceful and desperate, and trying to take care of his family in the only way he knew how. He called Lincoln Elementary that same day. "I'd like to speak with Principal Martinez," he told the receptionist. "I have an offer to make." 6 months later, Lincoln Elementary's cafeteria looked different. The same tables and chairs occupied the same space, but the energy had fundamentally changed. Where once there had been clear divisions between the kids who bought lunch, the kids who brought lunch, and the kids who went without, now there was simply community. The sharing station had evolved into something more sophisticated but no less heartfelt. Each classroom had a kindness corner where children could leave extra food, school supplies, or even notes of encouragement for classmates who might need them. Teachers had been trained to recognize signs of food insecurity and other needs. But more importantly, they'd learned to address these issues in ways that built students up rather than singling them out. The No Hungry Hearts program had expanded beyond Lincoln Elementary to encompass the entire district. Weekend backpack programs ensured that children from food-insecure families had meals when school was out. Summer programs provided both nutrition and community, keeping kids connected and fed during the long break. Family support services helped parents access job training, healthcare, housing assistance, and other resources in coordinated, dignified ways. But perhaps most remarkably, the program had become largely self-sustaining, funded by a combination of federal grants, local business partnerships, and community donations that had poured in from across the country after Milo's story gained national attention. Milo himself had become something of a reluctant celebrity. Interview requests came regularly, which he and his mother carefully selected based on whether they might help other families in similar situations. He'd spoken at school board meetings, appeared on morning television shows, and even given a short speech at a national conference on childhood hunger. Through it all, he remained remarkably unchanged, still quiet, still thoughtful, still more interested in taking care of others than in being the center of attention. "Do you ever regret telling your story?" a reporter had asked him during a recent interview. Milo had thought about it seriously, the way he approached most questions. "Sometimes I wish it had stayed private," he'd admitted. "But then I get letters from other kids who were going through the same thing, and they tell me that hearing about our family made them feel less alone. So I think it was worth it." The letters he referenced came from across the country. Children and families who had read about the Martinez family's experience and found the courage to seek help in their own communities. Social workers reported that references to the Lincoln Elementary model had become common in their field, with programs nationwide adapting the dignity-centered approach that had emerged from Mrs. Henderson's fourth-grade classroom. Maria Martinez had thrived in her new position at Chef Valdez's restaurant management company. What had started as a gesture of support, Chef Valdez offering her a job in his main restaurant, had evolved into something more significant when her organizational skills and natural empathy made her invaluable in developing the company's community outreach programs. She now oversaw Shared Tables, an initiative that redirected surplus food from the restaurant group's kitchens to families in need, and Second Chances, a job training program for parents recovering from unemployment or other economic hardships. "I never thought I'd be grateful for that terrible time," she told Mike Chun during a follow-up interview a year after his original article. "But going through that experience, and more importantly, getting help in a way that honored our dignity, it taught me something I never could have learned otherwise. It taught me that strength isn't about never needing help. It's about being brave enough to accept help when you need it and generous enough to offer it when you can." Lily Martinez had made perhaps the most dramatic recovery of all. With regular meals, medical care, and the stability that came from having their basic needs met, she had transformed from a listless, thin 6-year-old into an energetic 7-year-old who dominated her soccer team and had declared her intention to become either a doctor, to help sick kids like I was, or a chef, to make sure nobody goes hungry. Her health scare had turned out to be entirely related to malnutrition, a fact that had motivated both her mother and Milo to become vocal advocates for recognizing and addressing childhood hunger as a public health issue. The most lasting change, however, might have been in how the community understood itself. Lincoln Elementary had always been a decent school in a decent neighborhood, but it had also been a place where problems were handled quietly and individually, where struggling families often felt isolated and ashamed. Now, it had become a model for what educational communities could look like when they prioritized collective care over individual responsibility. The sharing stations had expanded beyond food to include clothing, school supplies, and even tutoring support. Parent volunteers coordinated carpools for families without reliable transportation, organized clothing swaps, and created informal networks that connected families with similar needs and resources. Most importantly, the stigma that had once surrounded needing help had largely disappeared, replaced by an understanding that supporting each other was simply what communities did. The remarkable thing, Ms. Rodriguez observed during a presentation about the program at a national education conference, is that we didn't actually create any new resources. We just reorganized existing resources around the principle that everyone deserves dignity and everyone has something to contribute. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, which showed a photograph of that year's fourth grade class gathered around their sharing station. Milo was visible in the back, no longer the thin, worried boy from the original story, but still recognizably himself. Thoughtful, kind, and quietly determined to take care of others. What we learned from these children, Ms. Rodriguez continued, is that the systems we create matter less than the spirit in which we create them. When we approach need with judgment and bureaucracy, we solve immediate problems but create lasting shame. When we approach need with love and community, we solve immediate problems and create lasting strength. The audience, educators, social workers, policymakers, and community organizers from across the country nodded in recognition. Many of them had traveled to this conference specifically to learn about the Lincoln Elementary model, hoping to adapt its principles to their own communities. After her presentation, Ms. Rodriguez was approached by dozens of people with questions, stories, and ideas for implementation. But the conversation that stayed with her happened during the lunch break, when a young teacher from rural Montana approached her with tears in her eyes. "I have a student," the teacher said quietly. "A little girl who reminds me so much of your Milo. She's been asking other kids for their leftover food, and I didn't know what to do. I was going to call her parents and report it as a potential theft issue. And now," Ms. Rodriguez prompted gently, "now I'm going to ask her if she needs help. And I'm going to make sure she knows that needing help doesn't make her less valuable or less worthy of love." These were the moments that made all the attention and publicity worthwhile, Ms. Rodriguez reflected as she watched the teacher walk away with renewed purpose. For every article written about Milo's story, for every television appearance the family made, for every award the school received, the real impact was measured in individual children who would no longer have to carry adult burdens alone. As she packed up her presentation materials, Ms. Rodriguez's phone buzzed with a text from Milo. Even though he was now in 5th grade and had a different homeroom teacher, he still stopped by her office regularly, sometimes for guidance, but often just to check in. The text was characteristically brief. "Saw the news about the school in Oregon starting their own sharing station program. Pretty cool." She smiled, typing back, "Pretty cool indeed. How are you doing, kiddo?" "Good. Lily's soccer game is tomorrow. She scored 3 goals last week. Tell her I said congratulations. See you Monday." "Yeah. Mrs. Patterson wants to talk to me about helping with the new kindergarten sharing station orientation." Ms. Rodriguez laughed out loud. Mrs. Patterson, the lunch monitor who had initially caught Milo with food in his backpack, had become one of the program's most enthusiastic supporters once she understood the real situation. She now coordinated the cafeteria components of the No Hungry Hearts initiative and had developed a particular talent for identifying children who might be struggling. More than that, she had become one of Milo's strongest advocates, often telling people that he had taught her the difference between rule following and problem solving. "He showed me that sometimes, when we see a child breaking a rule, we should ask ourselves whether the rule is serving the child or whether the child is trying to solve a problem that the rule doesn't address," she'd said during a staff meeting. "Now when I see something that looks wrong, my first question isn't, how do I stop this? It's, what is this child trying to tell me?" As Ms. Rodriguez drove home from the conference, she reflected on how much had changed since that afternoon when she'd overheard Milo trying to explain himself in Principal Martinez's office. The scared, thin boy who had carried the weight of his family's survival on his small shoulders had grown into a confident, thoughtful child who understood both his own worth and his responsibility to others. His family had moved from crisis to stability, from isolation to community, from shame to pride. But perhaps most importantly, they had moved from being recipients of help to being leaders in creating systems that would prevent other families from facing the same struggles. The ripple effects continued to spread. Other schools, other communities, other states had adapted elements of the Lincoln Elementary model. Social workers, teachers, and policymakers regularly cited Milo's story in discussions about childhood poverty and community-based solutions. Chef Valdez had expanded his job placement and community feeding programs to multiple cities, always crediting a 9-year-old boy who taught me that courage comes in all sizes. But for all the national attention and systemic change that had grown from that moment of crisis in the school cafeteria, the most important transformation remained the simplest. A hungry child had been fed, a struggling family had been supported, and a community had learned that taking care of each other wasn't just the right thing to do. It was the thing that made them stronger together than they had ever been apart. In the end, that was the real lesson of Milo's story. Not that one child's courage could change the world, though it certainly had. Not that communities could solve problems that systems couldn't, though they clearly could. But that the most profound changes often begin with the smallest acts of love. And that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply ask, "Are you going to eat that?" Because beneath that simple question lay a deeper one. Do you need help? And beneath that one, deeper still, how can we take care of each other? These were the questions that had transformed Lincoln Elementary from a school where children suffered in silence to a community where everyone belonged. They were the questions that had spread across the country, inspiring similar transformations in places far from that original cafeteria. And they were the questions that Milo Martinez, now 11 years old and still quietly determined to take care of others, continued to ask every day. Not because he had to anymore, but because he had learned that asking was how communities were built. One conversation, one shared meal, one act of courage at a time. The boy who had once asked for leftover food to feed his family had grown into a young man who understood that the most important thing anyone could share wasn't food at all. It was hope. And hope, unlike hunger, was something that grew when it was shared, something that multiplied when it was given away, something that could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities when it was offered with love, accepted with grace, and passed along with the quiet confidence that tomorrow could be better than today. In cafeterias across the country, children continued to ask, "Are you going to eat that?" But now, thanks to one boy's courage and one community's compassion, they were asking not from desperation, but from abundance. Not from need, but from love. And that, perhaps, made all the difference. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.